Hello, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you this morning on Channel 9 and on WJOP LP Newburyport FM 96.3. We're also live streaming on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel, which you can find at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm just delighted to welcome today's guest. Frank Schaeffer is here to talk about his new book called Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. He's a local author residing on Rings Island in Salisbury, and he's also the author, a New York Times bestselling author of more than a dozen books, both fiction and nonfiction. Frank has led a pretty extraordinary life. He's a survivor of both polio and an evangelical fundamentalist childhood. He's an acclaimed writer who overcame severe dyslexia, and he's also a self-taught documentary film director. He's also an artist with a loyal international following of collectors. Today, we're fortunate, as I said, to have him here to talk about his brand new book, just published on November 2nd, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, and Save the Planet. Frank, welcome to the morning show, and thank you so much for taking time to visit us today.
Thank you, Mary. And, you know, with you just living across the river from Salisbury, where I live, we could be shouting this across the Merrimack, but instead of that, we're doing it on Zoom. You know, why I didn't just come, I should have just come to your studio. You would have been a nice walk this morning.
That's right. We've had some bonus days this month too. We've been really fortunate. Well, Frank, I'm so glad to have you here because I so enjoyed reading your book. It's just chock full of ideas. And it appeared to me as I read it to be a very personal, very passionate, but also very carefully evidence-based plea for a transformation of the American dream, featuring a dramatically recalibrated balance between work and family life. You make the case for letting go of consumerism, status, and a definition of success based on financial accumulation. And you make the case for emphasizing much truer and more durable sources of happiness resulting from care, compassion, and connection. And they appeared to me to be two major influences in your life and on the vision that you champion. And I'd like to start today by asking you to talk some about, in turn, about both of those influences. First is the experience we all had of sheltering in place during the pandemic, and in particular, the effects of working from home, as well as caring for and educating children, and in your case, grandchildren from home. So could you talk a bit about how those experiences impacted your desire to write this book?
Yeah, well, Mary, it's an interesting story because I began this book quite some time ago when my granddaughter Lucy was a very little child. She's 13 now, so I probably started scratching out notes for this book when she was about 3. And they took the form of a diary really for her, as in, someday I'll tell you what your childhood was like. I will refresh your memories in terms of what we did. These began to be read by my wife, Jeannie, and then by some friends who said, you know, there's a book there in some form. And I really didn't know what that would eventually be. But as I settled into the role of a full-time caregiving grandfather and actually began to cancel speaking engagements and other things so that I could do this all the time, not just help Jeannie out, but be a nanny, as it were, for my 3 youngest grandchildren as they were born, Lucy, and then Jack, and then Nora. I began to ask myself a question, and that was, why am I enjoying what I'm doing now as a full-time caregiver, as a grandfather, more than anything else I've ever done? What is going on here? Because I didn't enjoy being a parent that much. I was away from home 6 months of the year. I look back with some regret on some of my disengagement. So I started doing some reading, and a second train of thought started, and that was the science of love. Love is not just a feeling. It's not a sentiment. It's not a Hallmark card. It's as real as a heart attack. It's as real as as knee surgery. This is biochemistry. This is neurological evolution at its highest form. And really what I discovered with the help of people like Myrna Perez, who was down at Harvard at the time, some very high-powered science-y friends of mine who teach at the university level, because this is not my field. I'm a writer. I'm not a scientist. I began to run some ideas by them, and they gave me a lot of homework. And what was going to be a 1 or 2 year project about taking care of my grandchildren actually spun into almost 6 years of work. And it was because Myrna and some of these other friends of mine began to give me things saying, look, you're on the right track, but you really need to do some more reading, because the cutting edge of science now is really shifted. For instance, one example, it used to all be about the survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
And now the new writing and the new research is all on the survival of the friendliest, cooperation, community, caregiving, sharing love, the getting and giving of care and love being the things that really make us tick, and involved evolution back into the very earliest stages of human development, where had it not been for the incentive of love, oxytocin and so forth, had it not been for the caregiving instinct in males, for instance, no one would have been around to help the females who had these very long gestation periods followed by long childhoods of socialization. So this branch of study just blew my mind. And that began to be folded into the book, kind of backing up, hey guys, it isn't just me feeling this about my grandchildren. This is a universal, and our culture's really missing something when we don't think that love and caregiving is the number one priority, rather than thinking career is the number one priority and we should fit these things in around them, kind of like, dessert after a 4-course meal. It's the other way around. If you get the love and caregiving part of your life in order, you have a shot at joy, not always happiness, because sometimes parenthood is very difficult, but at joy. So that was this kind of second string. Then a third weird thing happened, and that was that COVID hit. And I had been talking in theory in the book about, stay put, don't move around so much. You'll save the planet by being less consumeristic, by traveling less, by being with your family more, close connections of friends and lovers, whether you're pair bonded or not, non-binary or not, doesn't matter. You put these things first, and all of a sudden, and I'm not being flippant here because there are people I love who have died of COVID and people I love who have had COVID, but I'm not being flippant, but it was as if Mother Nature sent us a memo, said, let's try what he's writing about. You're all going home now. Time out. You've screwed things up. The planet's a mess. You go sit on the staircase for 20 minutes and think about it. Don't crayon on the wall anymore. You're going to have a timeout. So all of a sudden, there's no jet trails in the sky. The water's cleaner. Levels of pollution fall to levels that haven't been seen in 100 years. Carbon pollution and so forth. You can see photographs from outer space. The planet looks different, but also something else was changing. Bunch of career men and women, non-binary people, suddenly they're at home. Their options are very limited. They begin to look at each other. And as they start surfacing from this pandemic, they're saying, we're not going back to normal. We're quitting our jobs. Or like my son, John, I'm renegotiating my contract. I'll come into the office one day a week. If you don't want me to work from home, I'm done here. I'll find another job. And all of a sudden the headlines, the Great Resignation, people renegotiating, poll numbers on men who for the first time were the primary caregiver at home, or sharing the work with their wife, finding they liked it. They want to keep doing that. All of a sudden, it was as if the headlines, the book had been ripped from the headlines. It was actually happening. So then the book went through one more draft, and this was, I think, draft number 27 after 6 years of work, where I rewrote the book or edited the book from the point of view that half of what I was talking about here is no longer theoretical. It has just been tried.
Yes, absolutely.
Everybody stay put. Everybody went home. How's this going to shake it out? So those are the three threads that ran through the book and turned it into this project. And of course, the basis of the book itself is the joy I have found in being a full-time caregiving grandparent. And I don't mean like I help out a little bit and see people on the weekends. I'm talking about dawn to dusk for preschool children. I'm talking about cooking the 3 meals a day for them. I'm talking about building a play park in my own back garden so there was a place to be. I'm talking about renovating a barn with my grandson, Jack, and my granddaughters so they could play in it and also learn some carpentry, and all the reading aloud and everything else that's gone with it. And I have found tremendous fulfillment in that, in the context of a lot of other men starting to discover caregiving because of COVID. So these things kind of converged, and Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet suddenly became a kind of a rip from the headlines book, whereas it started as a very personal reminiscence on this precious time I was having with these wonderful young children and the joy it was bringing to me. Long answer. I promise not all my answers will be that long.
But a wonderful answer.
That's the thread of the book.
Yes, and it distills what makes the book very distinct, Frank. both the timeliness of it and the rip from the headlines quality, although it's clear that that's embedded in things that were kind of percolating in your life anyway. And it clearly, I think, were percolating in many other people's lives, because given the chance to have a time out on the staircase, as you said, people had the chance, I think, to catch up with themselves. And as they caught up with themselves, they were able to articulate, I think, some of the things that were leading them to feel off center with finding happiness and fulfillment in their life. And then, there's also the convergence with all of the really fascinating kind of scientific research, evolutionary psychology, neuropsychology that have been going on that simply undergird the things that you were talking about. So thank you for that. That was a great answer.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Well, and I have to hasten to add that the neuropsychology and all that stuff is not anything that is my field. But as a lay person, I was fortunate to have friends who are in this field, and they were very kind to me. Myrna Perez Sheldon in particular, who just kept going through my manuscript, why she had the patience to keep going through various drafts and sending me more reading, correcting them, and then saying, okay, now you have this bit right. So it's a lay person's approach to the subject, but it's informed by a few people who checked it to make sure that I wasn't making an utter fool of myself, even though they were much smarter than me in that field. So I hope the two mesh okay and are readable.
Well, I say yes, they do. And I think that part of what your book does is make a lot of this research very accessible and very clear to people, but also reading it, it is clear that it's very well documented, and there are resources that you suggest for people who want to follow up with the more specific kind of scientific research and the studies. They can do that, but I really appreciated the clarity of how you presented it, and you connect it to experiences people are actually having in their lives. So I thought that was a strength of the book. Well, there's another aspect of your biography that I referenced in my introduction, but it's a profound theme that runs throughout the book, and that is the impact of having grown up in an evangelical family. And your parents were both evangelicals, but they weren't just evangelicals. They were both, your mother and your father were major forces in shaping and expanding the evangelical movement. And you speak with great specificity and force in your book about the hypocrisy that you observed, and I'm using quote marks here, their presentation of family values, and also the oppressive sexism that you also observed, and your own struggle to break free from the church because it was breaking ties with your family in a lot of ways as well. So please talk to us a bit, Frank, about how your book's message and the things that you've come now to cherish and to advocate strongly for were influenced by these earlier experiences in your life.
Yeah, well, Mary, my own journey is typical of a lot of people who I regard as refugees from fundamentalist religion. That can be the daughter of a Saudi prince who has run away to Britain and is trying to hide from her domineering husband who wants her back. It can be the child of a Hasidic Jew in New York who was not educated because she's a girl and she has to go to some shelter and hide. Or it can be Frank Schaeffer, who was raised as evangelical royalty. I became the nepotistic sidekick of my dad when we were out on the road with Dr. Sierra Koop, who became Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General, pushing what I call fake family values, as opposed to the real family values in this book that I've written. And those fake family values were against women having access to reproductive rights, choice, contraceptive, abortion, and all these other things. If you look at what's happening in Texas today, for instance, this extreme manifestation of misogyny, unfortunately, sadly, horribly, for me, repentantly, there is a direct link between what my family was doing in the 1970s and 80s and some film series that I made for my father to illustrate some of his books that really were the bridge between the evangelical movement that at that time was not exactly apolitical, but you could meet evangelicals who voted for Democrats. You could meet evangelicals who were liberal and socialists. There's Nelson Rockefeller, who actually was someone my family knew, legalized abortion in New York. Ronald Reagan, who was a Republican at the time, legalized abortion in California. Unfortunately, my family, the Schaeffer clan, and my directing those movies was the kind of I don't know how to put it this way, but the tsunami that overwhelmed the fact that evangelicalism was much more diverse. So we made this series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race that kind of was the beginning of the evangelical litmus test on abortion that 40 years later puts Trump in the White House. So there's a lot there to regret. And so I'd mentioned this a little bit in the book, and my editor, Christine Valera, said, look, you've said just enough, so you have to now say more. You've got to go back and give us the forward and the thread that runs through the book of how really your question, Mary, was the one she asked, except she was saying, look, you've got to do more. And I said, oh man, I've written a memoir, crazy, forgot about this. Can't I just turn the page and talk about my grandchildren? And no, you've got to put this in the context of your own life. So kind of a fourth thread developed in the book, and that was kind of a confessional statement of how I've changed. And, I don't want to burden your program with bad language, but I can't put it any other way. And I say this in the book. I was raised in a kind of Calvinist Christian tradition, which essentially tells men they are in charge of women.
Yeah.
And that God has placed you in charge of your family. You're to be the disciplinarian with the children. Women are supposed to obey you. This is God's plan. And in a way, what it does is it nurtures the worst in the male of the species. Forget Christianity, pre-religion, probably pre-writing, pre-everything, this kind of domineering guy with upper body strength shoving females around and says, oh, no, this is God's great plan for your life. Yeah. Go for it. So the way I put it in my book, and again, excuse the language, as I say, essentially, I was raised to become an asshole by divine right.
Yeah.
Because usually when you're a jerk to people, there's somebody out there, if you're in a religious context, saying, wait a minute, this isn't what Jesus said, or whatever. Not in the context in which I was raised. Yeah. Pushing women around and dominating people and children and discipline and so forth was seen as, it's a hard call that you're supposed to be doing this. And of course, it's a disaster because we all look for validation of the things we know are wrong. And if someone's patting you on the back and saying, hey, this is the way you're meant to be, it took me a long time to work through that and say, look, I am utterly rejecting both this religious teaching, but also this way of interrelating with people. So when I come to the values of, say, putting relationships with people, whether friends or children or wife or family or lover or people you're working with, ahead of dominating them, ahead of power, ahead of money, ahead of defining ourselves by career, trying to redefine what we mean by the word success. Is it about the money or the position or the power, or is it about the quality of the relationships we have that actually bring us the most joy and give joy to other people? This book of mine doesn't come from a sort of a sterile academic interest. Right. It comes from someone who was on the wrong side of these issues and was more harmed by that than the people that he was bullying, being me.
Yeah.
Because my wife, Jeannie, who pushed back and to whom I owe my life, you were saying you do therapy. She's been my therapist. She's not a professional, but, a combination of tough and loving and stubborn and stick with it. And gradually, at the same time, giving me a motivation in the sense of loving her. I want to change for her. And then finding the person who had been suffering the most by being a bully and a misogynist was me. And the relief of coming to a place intellectually, but then also spiritually and psychologically, of kind of allowing this burden to fall off your back and saying, Jeannie is my best friend. And we are totally equal partners. Not only that, there's a lot I'm really bad at, like my finances and business. You're in charge, not me, on the merits. And not having any kind of sense of, oh, well, I ought to be in charge because I was raised to think men ought to be in charge. I don't think people who don't come from my background know what a bullying background is like in terms of saddling men with a burden. So I have a whole chapter in my book on why I think actually feminism is better for men than it is for women so far, in the sense that the people who really get liberated are the people who were given this burden of male domination. And when that slides away and you start looking at the whole human race in a very different way, whether it's women or non-binary people or the gay community, whatever, there's a freedom in that and a pleasure and in that reciprocity and community that I never knew, coming out of an evangelical background. So that thread runs through the book of the kind of mea culpa conversion story alongside. So I'm not saying, hey guys, be like me. I'm saying, no, there's a big chunk of my life where I'm telling you that the way I was is not the way you want to be. And I found something different. So that's kind of another thread in the book, a confessional thread, if you like.
It's a fascinating and a moving thread, I found, Frank, because it gives your vision of a transformed American dream a great deal of authenticity and credibility. And one of the things that is very moving in the book is actually the way that you clarify that this kind of patriarchal, dominating kind of vision of masculinity, it's causes great suffering and harm to men. And you include the sentence in the book, that at first, I went, what? And then I read on and understood why you say that feminism is evolution's greatest gift to men. And you just explained that. And there is much, that version of masculinity, as you were just describing, is being a huge burden for men to carry. And it does not lead to happiness. It does not create joy. It creates more suffering. Sometimes it prompts suicide, and it also prompts, spreading that misery outward through externalizing the source of your misery onto other people and trying to dominate, bully, or cause violence. So I think that was one of the really moving aspects of your book, and I'm really glad that you included it. Another aspect of your book that I found very intriguing is that you use familiar terms in new ways. Like instead of the survival of the fittest, it's the survival of the friendliest, which I love, by the way. But you ground these new usages of a broader meaning for a term in evolutionary science, which I also love. One of the terms that you used that I'd like you to talk a little bit more about is the centrality of mothering as a primary gratification, not just for women, but for men and for everybody, really. So please tell us more about how you are defining mothering and why it's essential for the success and happiness of our species.
Yeah, well, I do a little wordplay toward the beginning of the book, and it goes out through the book. And that is that, in some ways, I'd rather be a mother. And then I hasten to add, what I mean by that has nothing to do with gender or pregnancy or any of these things. It has to do with the using mothering as a verb, describing something. And to me, mothering is a good word to capture the nurturing nature that we men have, and non-binary people have, and my gay friends have, and you have. And the way I would describe it is like this, and I'm not trying to be cute. Right now, Mary, and I know you've been a psychotherapist, and I don't mean it that way, but right now, you and your producer who's helping you put this show on are mothering Frank Schaeffer. Because Frank is the child who's come into the kitchen saying, look, Mom, look at my picture. And you're saying, I'm going to take a magnet and stick this drawing on the refrigerator. This is a good thing you've done. And you are allowing me to shine for a minute as an author. And that is nurturing. Nurturing is giving someone the opportunity to let others see them as they wish they could be seen for a minute. We all live in a shadow where we don't see ourselves as we wish we could be seen. Nurturing that you're doing this morning, Mary, is allowing me the privilege for a few minutes to bring my book to your audience who listen or watch this. And you're saying, I'm going to let you shine for a minute. I'm going to let you talk for a minute. Now, I'm going to be like a real parent. Maybe I'll ask you some hard questions too. I may agree with everything you're doing, but this comes from a place of love and care. That's mothering. You are mothering. This morning, you are my mother, and it has nothing to do with gender. You could be a male host or a non-binary host, would all be the same. So to me, again, it has to do with this choice of how we define success. And I'm not trying to pull sort of Oprah-esque Hallmark card here, but the way I would just put it down is this. If you choose the path of power over others and commerce as the way you define yourself, look, there's nothing wrong with leadership. I think women make better leaders than men, by the way, as evidenced of how countries have done during the COVID crisis, amongst other things. But I'm not talking about we shouldn't lead. I'm talking about the acquisition of power over others through position and prestige, of always wanting the corner office, of not being a team player, and so forth and so on. If that's one path you chose, that leads to one kind of life. If you choose the other path, the mothering path, the caregiving path, then the mirror you look in is not the size of your paycheck or the name of your career or your position in a company or how much money you have. The only mirror you trust is what you see written in the eyes of the people who know you best and who love you.
Yeah.
If, and I'm speaking from experience, with my daughter Jessica, when she was little and I was a teen parent in a fundamentalist community, what you see in her eyes is fear when you shout at her and yell and scream and demand her obedience, or you see loathing and sadness in the eyes of someone you're in love with because you're this jerk husband trying to dominate your wife. You should trust that mirror because it's telling you the truth. If, on the other hand, when Nora runs down my driveway now and I take care of her, this little 7-year-old, or I pick her up at school and she clambers into my van and we drive home, and all you see shining in her eyes is unconditional trust and love, and she slips her hand into yours and starts talking to you about the day she's had, and when you look at her face, you know that she's expecting nothing but good things. You can read it in her eyes. She's not scared. She's not trepidatious. And you're seeing her as she is, as she wishes to be seen. She's telling you everything. That's a different mirror. And you know who you are at that moment. So I've seen both things reflected back in the eyes of people I've loved. And the fear and the loathing and the sorrow is reflected back when you're living in a way that generates that response. And sadly, of course, mine comes from a fundamentalist background, but I think that same response gets generated by the kind of what I'll call the billionaire impulse. You know, you're using everybody around you to do this fancy startup company. The real issue is not, you know, can you build your own rocket ship? It's what does the billionaire see in the eyes of the people closest to him or her? That's the question. And that's the way my book really goes about trying to define what success is.
Yeah. You know, it's really interesting, Frank, and you've summed that up really well in terms of the mirroring and getting a clear sense of the impact you're having on other people from what you see in their eyes. But it reminds me of, I used to do workshops on family influences on career paths, and we would talk about messages about success. And I had an activity I would have people do. I'd ask people to think about who they thought was the most successful person and who they thought was the happiest person they knew. And what was almost invariably, it would happen that somebody would say the most successful person was Bill Gates. It was always Bill Gates. This was a few years ago. I don't know who it would be now. Maybe Jeff Bezos or maybe, you know, Elon Musk. But it was always somebody who was best known for being the richest. And yet when they thought about who was the happiest person they knew, it wasn't Bill Gates. It wasn't Jeff Bezos. It was usually somebody they knew, often a family member, often a grandparent, but somebody who seemed wise to them. Somebody, I think, whom they had looked in their eyes and they'd seen the person, as you put it, that they wanted to be seen as. And I think their vision of that person as being the happiest person they knew also reflected a happiness that they felt in the relationship. And so that was always, you put these two things next to one another and you have to go, wait a minute, what am I building my life on? What am I striving for here? What do I want? A kind of a shallower version of success that's built on accumulation, or do I want to wind up being a wise and happy person? So this brings me to another thing I wanted to ask you about, though, Frank, because you presented some research in your book that I was not familiar with and found really fascinating, because it's not hard to look around the world or the news and see so many examples of people who are striving actually actively for power and domination over others, and who seem often indifferent or callous to the suffering or the danger that other people might be in spite of those evolutionary forces that we were talking about at the beginning that might otherwise have nudged them toward compassion and kindness. And our corporate and political systems certainly reward striving for the very things that pull us away from family and from mothering, as you have beautifully defined it. So the question arises, how do we resolve this contradiction in our culture? And you present some fascinating research in your book on the impact that power has. Literally, it changes people's brains. And so I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about what that research shows.
Yeah, well, there was this study that I first learned about listening to NPR, and then I went and did some reading and sent it off to people who know more. And they said, yeah, this is a real thing. It's actually happening. And it wasn't just one study, but cumulatively, what these studies did is they found different ways the same way they study pain tolerance, what do you feel, push the button, reaction times, and so forth. When people, the bottom line is the research all agreed on something, and that was that when people were feeling power over others, the level of their empathy began to drain away. So in the test subjects, they would put people in positions where they were feeling powerful and other people where they were feeling less powerful over the situation. And then they would test impulses toward others, looking at pictures of people in need, whatever it may be. And invariably, the people who were feeling the most powerful at the time, because they had been put in situations that they felt they were controlling as test subjects, always acted with less empathy towards people with less power who seemed unfortunate. The more powerless people felt in the as test subjects, however they were running the test, and there were various ways they did this, the more empathy they showed as they were tested in terms of, look at this picture, what is your reaction, and so forth and so on. And then other people got into the field after these people had run these tests and tried to verify them. And they found that in all cases, there was no contradiction of this. And that was that however you test it, whether it's people in power themselves, level of empathy that's measured by actions, or whether it is test subjects in a test where someone's put in a position feeling they're controlling the situation, the more powerful you're feeling at that moment, the less you can measure the empathy you have for others. So that they were looking at how this affects leadership and showing that people who are in positions of power are actually going to have to work very hard to maintain a sense of empathy for the people they're in power over. And of course, that can be a family structure, or it can be an individual, but it can also be political. And it kind of fits with the way we know the world. We kind of intuitively know. This has been a theme in art forever. That when you look at a Saint Francis of Assisi, for instance, speaking to the popes, you have the powerless monk is speaking for the people and the poor, and the popes are living it up in the Vatican in Rome. You have this disparity between the prince and the people. This is the theme, the theme of the both the Russian and the French revolutions, America not wanting a king, but wanting a president. This theme goes through history, but now we have modern research in psychology and neuropsychology, which actually proves the point, which is that we now know that feeling powerful, not necessarily even being powerful, but feeling you are powerful, or say entitled to power as the male head of the home, whatever, turns off the bits of the brain or rewires your brain, because our brains are malleable, actually changes the brain and makes you feel less compassionate, less empathy for people. Sort of a no-brainer, but there it is. It's now been studied and proven.
Well, and of course it's observable, but it's always helpful to have the scientific undergirding. Because then you can't gloss it over or pretend that something else is going on than what we're actually observing. And it's interesting, Frank, because there's a phrase, I forget who originally said it, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Sure. But now it's clear, given the research you've been describing, that the nature of that corruption is the diminishment of the capacity to feel empathy.
It is.
And I think that's a really important thing for all of us to sit in the stairwell and reflect upon during our time out.
There was an article a few years ago in the New Yorker by somebody, and then some studies bore this out that were basically anecdotal, but it was from a doorman who had gotten a job in the building that the Koch brothers live in, and a bunch of other billionaires in New York on Park Avenue. And he said, I thought I had it made, that I was going to get the biggest Christmas tips as doorman that were ever given to anybody. I was expecting a lot. He said, I got less than I was when I was a doorman in a middle-class building up on the Upper West Side, that the tips were stingier. And, I mean, that's not going to prove anything, but it fits.
It's indicative.
And it fits with the way we know life to be too, doesn't it? I mean, it's the different people
That's a great story. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I mean, and that got some circulation. But there's a point in the book I wanted to bring up on the level of trying to change things that I also cite in the book, and I know you're aware of this, you read it, but I just want to make a point of it. And that is that when you look at the title of my book, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, it can be read as a kind of conventional mantra of, the white heterosexual married children and grandchildren relationship. And in my case, I'm the old white guy pushing 70. I'm the okay boomer. Yes, that's me. And that's who I am. I'm a monogamous guy married for 52 years in a heterosexual relationship. But one of the through lines of my book is that this book is not written just for people like me.
Yeah.
And I talk about the studies showing the capacity to change our brains that are experienced by gay adoptive parents that are non-biologically related. And these studies that blew the minds of the people doing the studies, they were studying the neurobiology of women who had just delivered and what was going on in their brains as they bonded with their babies, breastfeeding and so forth in the first weeks and months of life. And as a control group for that, so they could see what was only happening to women. This is like 25 years ago now, and of course, the beginnings of these studies. They studied male adoptive parents to show how different it would be, because how unique the bonding would be for women. And what they found was the exact opposite. And that is, they studied gay adoptive fathers of non-biological children and not even newborn infants, and found that the fathers that spent the time with the child, that was the kicker. The fathers that spent the time with the child were bonding. Yeah. When they measured hormonal levels in saliva and blood pressure, brain scans, they found the exact same things they were finding in the mothers. They found, in fact, that unless you put the names and the numbers on the experiment, you couldn't tell the difference, because men evolved to be nurturers.
Yeah.
Which leads me to a point I make in the book, that it's only in the modern construct where we have this sort of nuclear family isolated living over here, and then somebody goes to work, and who's going to be the caregiver? If you go back to the farming community I was raised in Switzerland as a child in the 1950s, and it was a very primitive little village, and it could have been 100 years before that. There were still horses rather than tractors at that time in my little village. If you looked at people bringing the hay and you looked out in the field, it was the mother, the parent, the grandparent. They're all out there, all hands on deck. We're cutting the hay field. We're raking the hay. The sun is shining, bring the hay in. Maybe the old guy is sitting in the corner under a tree with the toddlers. But there was no division of labor of like, this is men's work, this is women's work. Yeah. This was a family. This was an extended intergenerational family project backed up by the entire village. We had one power tool in the village to run the bandsaws for people to cut firewood for their wood burning stoves. That would be passed around. It's only in the modern construct of career, in the sense of the 1950, picture that old movie where all those guys are arriving on the train in Grand Central Station. They all have the same hat on and the same briefcase, and they're all there. They look like robots streaming out of the trains to work. And somewhere in the background, there's a woman at home doing, taking care of whatever. That is totally false to the way humans actually evolved. Yeah. So no wonder our quotient of loneliness is skyrocketing, suicide skyrocketing, addiction is skyrocketing.
Yeah, that's right.
It isn't because Jesus told us to live differently, or religion, or philosophy, or even psychotherapy in terms of how to be happy. It's because we have constructed a culture that, if you point by point said, how can we build a culture as an experiment to see how far away you can take people from their evolutionary roots before they all kill themselves? This would be it.
Yeah.
And then the other part of American culture is, how can you build a culture that is fundamentally anti-woman, anti-child? This would be it. And so if you look at the way, for instance, the COVID epidemic has disproportionately sandbagged women's careers, what does that tell us about how we've organized childcare in this country? Yeah. When Pete Buttigieg takes some time off to be with his adoptive twins, and he's mocked on right-wing media, what does this tell us about the so-called family values of the pro-lifers, who, here's a father who wants to spend time with his children, and you're mocking him, and you're going to Congress and trying to stop paid family leave for paternity care and maternity care, and at the same time you claim to be pro-life. These are the discussions that I hope come out of people who read my book. And that level of hypocrisy in the right-wing world I came from. And I'll just finish up by going one extra point. I say in the book that we have a model of a community within our national community that has in fact put love first. And that is the gay community coming out of the gay pride movement in the 70s and 80s. They're the first group in America who said, we are going to define ourselves by the right to love, not by the right to earn money or make money or have power over people, not to tell you what to do. the gay community stood up and said, we are going to define ourselves, the lesbian and the male gay community first. And now, of course, it's the trans community and the non-binary as they add these things, have stood up and said, listen, time out. We're not talking about career here. We're not talking about money. We're not talking about power over others. We're talking about the right to love. And what I'm saying in my book is it's time for the rest of us to get on board. We need to redefine this culture by the right to love. So women should not have to be arguing for taking a year of paid leave, but nor should men. It should be perfectly normal for a high-powered male, say he's a resident at Mass General in vascular medicine. He should be able to take a year out to be with that adopted person or with that child and spell his wife, who maybe she's having a career as a teacher. Why can't he come back to the same position? Why do so many men I know who look at me enviously saying, wow, I wish I could take time with my children the way you're taking time with your grandchildren, but my career would really suffer. I wouldn't be taken seriously anymore. I'd never make partner in my law office. And then if you go to the other end, what about the young mom who's working 3 jobs at the lower economic scale at Walmart or Burger King, trying to pay bills 2 days after she delivers her baby? She's got to be back at work. She's still bleeding, for God's sake. What's wrong with you people? In other words, on the level of just barbarism, this is disgusting. We don't give her any space. She should have a year at home with that child if she wants it, or government-sponsored childcare. Why are we making her going back to work? She had a C-section. She had major surgery. She's back at work because there's no provision for the single mother. What are we going to do for single moms? And, my message to my old right-wing friends is, listen, I never want to hear you talk about family values again until you march on Washington and demand paid leave for young parents, childcare, and help for single mothers, particularly. Get on board with the program that the gay community outlined, the right to love. Otherwise, just be quiet about all of this stuff. So I get quite pissed off about this because I come from that background and the hypocrisy is stunning. I really can stand it.
Well, you make the point with great force and great clarity, Frank. And I think I love the way you put that within the historical context of the growth of the gay rights movement, providing an example of values that come out of deciding to say, love is what matters.
And the gay community is still having to fight those battles.
The country, 3 steps backward for every 2 steps forward, but the forward march continues. It's never going to stop.
And that goes to show it's worth making these arguments, because I'm hoping that we can go to the next step and say, and guess what? Everybody ought to be making these demands for paid family leave and so forth and so on. So let's get, and that's what, of course, what I'm hoping my book does is help, is a little bit of a step in that direction.
It's clearly a step in that direction. And it's a nice segue then into something else that I found very interesting and important, a point that you make in your book, that all of these things you're talking about in terms of rebalancing, prioritizing family and rebalancing that with work and changing the definition of success, it's not just nice for us to have, but it's a matter of life and death. Because you talk about the research, really fascinating research coming out of the pandemic about statistical verifiable changes during the pandemic on infant mortality and premature births. So I was hoping that you could also talk a little bit about, what the research has shown us when parents are actually staying home and spending more time with their children, especially newborns.
And it was a surprise to everyone. And there were several articles in the New York Times about it. And then it was picked up in the New Yorker and then other members of the international press. But I want to start by saying it didn't become as big a story as I think it should have, because corporate America doesn't want to know about this. And I am not a conspiracist. I don't believe there's 3 guys sitting in Washington dictating everything. And, that's all crap. But nevertheless, there is a vibe out there that says, don't tell us that if we gave more time to pregnant women to stay home and take care of themselves during pregnancy, there'd be less miscarriages. We don't want to know about that. Whose agendas is that fitting? Doesn't fit with Harvard's agenda. They've got to, they want young women and, getting an MBA and going out, breaking the glass ceiling. Doesn't fit with the New York Times, because their whole thing has been a kind of a rah capitalism. You know, they're supposedly liberal, but it's very oriented towards the corporate world as much as the Wall Street Journal is. So the funny thing is, to me, the first thing to note is this story got buried. And that was, it came from the medical profession. And the article that I first saw are, where are the preemies? Because with women at home, premature births went down to almost zero statistically, where normally there's a much higher proportion. Miscarriages, lowest number of miscarriages in US history. Now, miscarriages and premature births are very well documented. These are actual real numbers. And no one denied this. When the numbers came out, there was no question that women taking better care of themselves because they were at home for another reason, which was COVID, actually led to less miscarriages, less premature and infant mortality numbers started going down as well, because of course, with less premature babies, that ticks up into the infant mortality. Nobody wanted to know about this. So the stories came out and they were real, and no one said, oh no, you got the numbers wrong, but they just sort of went away. Whereas actually it should have been the cover of, the Sunday magazine, because this is big news. I mean, everybody wants to know about women's health. This is a big thing. Less stressful life, a time out, being able to treat your pregnancy with a little more reverence and be at home, less stress in the office and the work, less commuting. I mean, less sitting there in that car driving 2 hours in each direction. Nobody saw it coming, but actually added up to less premature births and a better infant mortality number. And miscarriages were the thing that nosedived. So they first noticed it in England with the National Health System, which of course they document everything. And then American doctors started saying the same thing. And finally, the New York Times published a study, and I cited that and a couple of others that came up that were coming out. But it was like news to everybody. But there was nobody wanted really to know about this, because it doesn't feed any of the mythology of a kind of a career-oriented life that is favored by corporate America, which is, they only want news that tells you that shareholder profits are a great thing, and let's just fight for that. Not inconvenient things like women get pregnant and sometimes it's dangerous. We don't want to talk about their miscarriages. We just want to talk about, what they're contributing to the company. My daughter, who's a CEO in New York City, I quote her saying, before COVID, you kind of had to hide your family. You had to sort of pretend you didn't even have children. If you were serious about your career and going to be a CEO of a company like she is, you had to sort of pretend, oh, this is all I care about. And another woman, Christine Derrico, who's a judge in Connecticut, who's a friend of mine, was saying how up until COVID, she and some of her friends, very high-powered women in high positions, would compare notes on how they would lie about where they were during the day. They'd get a call and they would pretend they're in the office, because she's also a lawyer as well as a judge. And she says, we're done with that. It's like, no, I'm doing a school pickup now. You got a problem with that? Or I'm driving to New Jersey to take care of my mother and I'm taking 2 days off, because caregiving, of course, for the other end of life is something we also pretend doesn't exist. And so we don't pay caregivers well when they're professionals. We treat them like second-class citizens. When moms are in high-paid positions in corporations, they have to pretend they don't have families. And Jessica was talking about how that was all breaking down on Zoom calls. She said, I put this in the book. She sent me an email saying I was talking with a bank president the other day, and he said, shh, I have to talk quietly because I just put my toddler down for a nap. And she said, okay, you could hear toilets flush in Zoom meetings, kids would run through, dogs would bark. The mythology that life can be kept separate from career just evaporated. And of course, women are tired now, because women, again, I say, women got it in the neck. They were told to go have these big, fancy, high-paid careers. Then nobody came to help them when COVID hits. Now they're stuck at home. Now, no, and so when you look at this thing here, I'm just saying that the biggest victims of the present day are women. And until we have what I would call a kind of a recognition that feminism is an evolutionary step to do with our survival, that if we do not begin to address the women's agenda in the workplace and in the home and in the country, it isn't a question that this is the right thing to do because we're all into tolerance and diversity or whatever. The arc of the universe or whatever, trending towards justice. No, it's nothing to do with justice. It's to do with survival. If we don't start having a communitarian approach to childcare, paid family leave, childcare as a right for women. Workplace childcare. All these fancy corporations like Google have all this crap, skateboards in the hallway, sushi at lunch. I've spoken at Google Talks a couple times. Oh, it's a wonderful place to work. We have all these toys. How about a first-class Montessori-run daycare center for every single employee?
That's a brilliant idea.
Bring your children to work so that mom's up on the 9th floor in the corner office doing computer algorithms, and her little kid Bobby's down there having a tantrum. They can call her and say, could you come down here? He's really sad this morning. And she could spend time with her child. Why is that so weird when you picture a farming community where there's somebody sitting off in the corner with the kids while the parents are working in the field? This is normal. What's abnormal is companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter and all these other guys doing this big fancy crap. And yet their female employees have to either hide they're having children, pretend they're not pregnant, and then when they do have kids, basically it's like, well, who's going to step up and help with this? The company demands everything and has given nothing back when it comes to kids. So if little companies can't afford this, this ought to be a government program, not just, quote, childcare theoretically, childcare in the workplace. How far away do you want to be for your kids? How about here, right here, down there? I can see them playing in the play yard outside my corporate headquarters. Factories. Jeff Bezos could spend his money providing the best childcare facilities in the world for the women and the men working for him. A single father trying to raise 2 kids. One of them's a toddler. Why can't there be a Montessori-run first-class childcare unit on every single warehouse where thousands of people are working? You bring your kid, you drop them off in the morning. It's one of the corporate benefits along with medical care. Sorry, Jeff, you're going to have to build less rocket ships, but your employees will stay with you forever. The Great Resignation, all this stuff where everybody's quitting. Imagine a company that said, look, we'll talk to you about your pay. That's part of the deal. But let me first tell you about our healthcare. Let us tell you about the 1 year of paid family leave we give every single male, female, non-binary person. Let me tell you that all our corporate headquarters and every single plant we have has a childcare facility for kids aged 6 months up to 5 years of age. And we provide first-class preschool. The person interviewing for the job would be more interested in those things than they were in the size of their paycheck, if they're anybody I know. And you'd be saying, holy shit, at last, a company that speaks human, a company that speaks human.
Well, Frank, I'm glad you ended on that note, because what I was thinking about as you were talking about these things that are really public health issues and humanitarian issues, is that they are not partisan issues. They are way beyond politics and partisan issues, but they are the survival of our species issues, the sanity of our species, the well-being of our species. And that's what hopefully, as people catch on, and reading your book will be a helpful way, I think, for people to catch on. People will be able to develop a framework which breaks the partisan fever and the polarization and enables people to start thinking about, wait a minute, we're all human beings first and foremost. We have one planet and we've got one life. So let's do a better job. Well, Frank, it's just, thank you so much. It's just been wonderfully informative and hugely fun to talk with you.
Mary, thank you for having me on. And listen, I can be reached. I am local and I can talk folks. They can get in touch with me, listen to my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, that's available in all the usual places, and or just go online to Twitter or Facebook and find me. And if you want to email me, please do. And we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yes, I was going to ask you how people could find out more about you, Frank. And you
they can email me, and those email addresses are right on all my sites. So just go somewhere.
Great.
Anywhere it says Frank Schaeffer, you'll be able to find me and get to me.
Just Google Frank Schaeffer and you'll wind up with Frank.
That's it.
Frank, thank you so much. It's just been wonderful to talk to you. I really appreciate your being generous with your time with us this morning,
Mary.
and sharing your ideas, your life experiences, and your passion. Thank you so much. And thanks for writing the book.
Thanks a lot, Mary.
Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you'll join us next Thursday at 9 on Channel 9 for the morning show. If you missed any part of today's show, it'll be available for viewing on PortMedia's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show at ncmhub.org. Just click on YouTube, click on playlist, and then scroll down for the morning show. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday morning at 8 a.m. and the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. and Wednesday at 3 p.m. and will also be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Just go to ncmhub.org, click on the cloud icon in the upper right-hand corner and scroll down. That's it for today, everybody. Thank you, Frank. Farewell.